2 years after leaving my community, I was waiting for a routine checkup at a women's health clinic when a simple blue and white pamphlet caught my eye from a plastic holder near the entryway. I reached for it merely out of boredom, flipping through pages of old magazines. On the second page, a brief paragraph detailed specific behaviors: coercing a significant other into pregnancy, ignoring a partner's pleas to pause or halt, and undermining a woman's autonomy over her own physical form. I read those lines over and over, pressing my thumb against the paper's edge until my skin lost its color. That short text perfectly captured my entire marriage. Every single phrase felt as though it had been drafted by an observer who knew my home, recognized my spouse's tone, and witnessed me sitting in absolute silence while my internal voice pleaded otherwise. Though I had lived outside the fold for 2 seasons and believed I had processed my history, viewing sorrow as my heaviest burden, that moment in the waiting room revealed that my pain had deeper layers. Below the initial grief lay an unmapped space, defined by a term I was never permitted to learn, a single word encompassing 11 years of my existence. Yet, to explain that depth, I must first describe the surface, which was crafted so flawlessly that I spent a decade within it without ever sensing the foundation beneath. This space exists for women to share the narratives they were historically forced to suppress. These are first-hand accounts emerging from insular societies, restrictive marriages, and closed frameworks, spoken with absolute truth because remaining quiet never offered true protection. It was merely an absence of speech. If these words resonate deeply or pull an unnamed memory to the surface of your own consciousness, I invite you to listen closely to what follows. Uncovering the truth beneath the facade of my own relationship completely altered my perception of reality. If you find value in these testimonies, consider continuing this journey with me. Should you feel compelled to share, please recount a single realization about your own history that shattered your original perception. Just one line can carry immense weight. Your words hold power. To an outsider, my daily life resembled a picturesque scene from a traditional calendar, complete with a white farmhouse, a flourishing green garden, and rows of laundry fluttering in the breeze, rows filled with small dresses, tiny shirts, and even smaller garments that seemed to continuously multiply. My husband earned a living crafting furniture, while my late summers were consumed by preserving tomatoes in August and peaches in September. Dressed in my traditional prayer covering, apron, and plain garment, I maintained a spotless kitchen and delivered my babies in our rear bedroom, assisted only by a local midwife and my mother-in-law waiting by the entranceway. Over a 10-year span, 7 infants arrived. Each pregnancy was met with the same muted acceptance, devoid of either overt joy or dread, as expressing such intense emotions would be viewed as hochmut or worldly vanity. You simply accepted what came, carried the burden, and gave birth. This was the prescribed path for a devout woman, and I inhabited that role as naturally as my daily attire, never questioning its fit. I must be entirely precise in describing this, because the young mother standing over that hot stove, tending to a toddler while expecting another, possessed neither ignorance nor weakness. She was merely operating within the boundaries of the only reality she had ever known, a framework where every piece aligned perfectly. Large families were viewed as divine rewards for the pious, and a crowded home stood as validation of a holy union. Fatigue was simply the toll required for submission, and submission secured your place within the flock, which was the sole currency that protected your entire existence. When exhaustion settled deep into my skeletal frame, aching in my lower lumbar and clouding the space behind my eyes, I accepted it as confirmation of my righteousness. It meant I was sacrificing sufficiently to please the Almighty. I never disputed this reality. In truth, I lacked the capability to do so because our insular world had systematically eradicated the very vocabulary required to formulate such a question. My spouse was far from a malicious person, a point I wished to establish clearly and early, because my subsequent revelations do not cancel out his better qualities. He was a reserved man who labored through extended shifts, yet he spent cold winter nights carving detailed wooden playthings for our offspring, creating tiny horse-drawn wagons with operational wheels. Before daybreak, he would silently place a mug of coffee on the table for me while I sat nursing our latest infant. He never raised his voice in anger, nor did he ever strike me. For a long time, the mere absence of shouting and physical violence formed my entire understanding of a successful partnership. I had no idea that this metric was fundamentally flawed, or that a domestic life could appear entirely peaceful on top while slowly eroding your core identity until nothing remained. I only recognized the path laid out before me, a life that, from every sanctioned perspective, looked precisely like a divine blessing. The children arrived in such rapid succession that my physical form never had an opportunity to heal before the next cycle commenced. On 4 separate occasions, I found myself nursing a newborn while simultaneously developing another life within my womb, a process that left my bones aching, my milk depleted, and my cognitive faculties entirely drained. The local practitioner suggested increasing my intake of liver, while my husband's mother advised resting alongside the infant, but neither ever suggested that I could simply stop. The concept of halting was never presented as a valid choice for a woman. Looking back from the present day, equipped with a vocabulary that was denied to me then, I recognize that stripping away that choice was an intentional design. It formed the foundational, unseen boundary upon which our entire social structure was erected to ensure its apparent permanence. I distinctly recall a specific morning that marked the initial, minuscule fracture in this facade, a shift so subtle it almost went entirely unnoticed. While expecting our 6th child, with my 5th only 11 months old, the kitchen suddenly seemed to tilt on its axis, forcing me to brace myself against the countertop until the sensation passed. Later that same week, our medical provider arrived. She was an outsider to our faith, an English midwife who provided maternal care to several households across our region. After assessing the fetus and checking my vitals, she extended an inquiry that no one from my own background had ever dared to voice. Her words were measured, spoken with the hesitant caution of someone stepping across an unspoken boundary. She gently asked if I wished to explore methods for spacing out future pregnancies once this child arrived. In that exact instant, a strange sensation stirred within my chest. Not a wide awakening, but a momentary vulnerability, like a heavy shutter caught in a sudden gust of wind before snapping shut again. I informed her that such practices were not permitted among our people. She simply gave a quiet nod and noted it down in her paperwork. I stood there, cradling my abdomen, deeply unsettled by the encounter, wondering why she would introduce such a concept unless an alternative path truly existed. That interaction was the initial fracture. It offered no grand resolutions or direct inquiries, manifest only in the way her gaze lingered on my face, just a beat longer than necessary. Her silent acknowledgement revealed that she had witnessed this exact exchange in countless other households, recognizing the unspoken reality beneath my words. Although I failed to comprehend the true meaning behind her expression at the time, that initial fracture remained. Once you detect a flaw in a structure you assumed was indestructible, your perception shifts permanently, causing you to notice subtle patterns everywhere. I began to see my neighbor enduring her 8th pregnancy with the exact same stoic expression I recognized from my own reflection, a look that I now realize signified quiet endurance rather than spiritual serenity. I noticed that no woman in our congregation ever uttered the words, "I do not wish to," whether discussing childbearing or any other aspect of existence, as that sentiment was entirely absent from our vocabulary. I began to observe our world through a different lens, characterizing my feelings not as a valid inquiry, but as a dangerous spiritual wavering, the exact type of inner turmoil that devout wives were admonished to banish through prayer. Viewing my thoughts as sinful ingratitude, I begged for divine absolution, yet the internal investigation had already commenced. Beneath the surface of our picture-perfect lifestyle, the handmade bedding, the soft-spoken spouse, and the gift of 7 offspring, an underlying reality was taking shape. I could not yet perceive its full dimensions, catching only its rough edges, much like encountering a buried boulder beneath the dirt before a spade strikes it squarely, something unyielding, deeply embedded, and permanently present. Yet that realization was merely the initial threshold. I had identified the split in the wall, but I had not yet bent down to peer through the opening. When I finally gathered the courage to do so years later, far removed from that farmhouse kitchen, the truth I discovered did not center on my husband's individual actions, but on a vast, ancient system far more elaborate than anything a single person could construct independently. To fully explain this, I must return to those specific households and particular evenings, because the long examination that followed, a process spanning years that stripped away my rest, my confidence, and my comforting illusions, compelled me to revisit past events and decode them in an entirely new light. This represents the most painful stage of the journey, not merely due to the inherent distress of the events, but because reframing them requires acknowledging that my younger self was completely oblivious to her own reality. I must afford that younger version of myself deep compassion. She was navigating her world with the limited tools available to her, completely lacking the perspective required to analyze her environment from an external vantage point. The initial event demanding reevaluation occurred shortly after the birth of our third baby, who was a mere 4 weeks old at the time. My physical form was still discharging blood, experiencing the steady, lingering healing process that follows the profound labor of delivering a child into the world. While I was cradling the infant in the nighttime shadows beside our mattress, my spouse reached out for me as I slipped back under the bedding. At that particular moment, I rationalized the encounter as the standard obligation of matrimony, telling myself that he had shown great restraint by waiting nearly a month. I believed that a dutiful companion should never test her partner's forbearance unnecessarily. The reality of my unhealed flesh never crossed my mind, nor did the thought that I simply did not desire the intimacy, because such concepts were completely missing from the worldview I had been taught to accept. I possessed no internal phrasing that began with a declaration of personal refusal regarding physical intimacy with my husband. That entire concept had been erased from my understanding long before I could even articulate it. Today, I view that night through an entirely different lens, recognizing that when a man initiates intimacy with a woman whose body is still recovering from childbirth without seeking her explicit consent, failing to check in through words, expressions, or any reassuring gesture, it does not demonstrate restraint. It reveals a deep-seated presumption, an unspoken entitlement rooted in the belief that her physical self is constantly accessible simply because serving that purpose is its fundamental reason for being. He displayed no malice during those moments. His touch remained gentle and his words quiet. Yet I now understand that tenderness forced upon someone without their active choice is a contradiction in terms, representing a reality I could not properly identify until much later in life. Through counseling, I discovered that my internal response that evening, the way I mentally detached from my physical form, retreating deep within my own mind to observe the encounter from a safe distance, while my physical self fulfilled its obligations, is a recognized psychological mechanism known as dissociation. That specific terminology remained unknown to me for nearly a decade. Another distinct memory surfaces from my fifth pregnancy, when I sought refuge in the outbuildings because our home felt claustrophobic, the children were overwhelming, and I desperately needed a space free from physical demands. My spouse tracked me down to check on my well-being, prompting me to explain my state with extreme caution, selecting my words with the delicate care one uses when handling fragile glassware. I softly confessed that I felt incapable of enduring the cycle yet again, using the term weary because it was the only approved descriptor at my disposal. My internal reality was far more profound and devastating than mere physical exhaustion, but I lacked the vocabulary to express it. He remained silent for a moment before offering a response that I have turned over in my mind countless times since that day, gently reminding me that the choice did not belong to us, as children are divine gifts to be accepted unconditionally. He spoke with the sincere conviction of a true believer, which makes the memory uniquely challenging to process. He was not engaging in deliberate deception or manipulation, but simply echoing the teachings of his Father, the proclamations of the ministry, and the strict tenets of our Ordnung. He inhabited the exact same confines that I did, yet he remained entirely oblivious to the boundaries. I recall another specific instance during a Sunday worship service while expecting yet again, either with our sixth or seventh child, as the successive pregnancies eventually blurred together like a row of boundary stakes glimpsed from a speeding horse-drawn carriage. The church elder was delivering a sermon focused on the biblical text of Psalm 127, proclaiming that offspring are a sacred inheritance and praising the man who possesses an abundance of them. Seated on the benches designated for women, I grappled with severe back pain and swollen lower limbs while the fetus pressed heavily against my bladder. I forced myself to remain perfectly still, knowing that exiting the service to seek relief during the preaching would draw unwanted scrutiny, an outcome that women in our society were conditioned to evade at all costs, treating public attention like a dangerous hazard. Scanning the room, I observed my peers. Rachel, who was currently expecting her ninth child, Leah, who had already buried 4 infants and was now carrying her 5th, and Martha, who sat with motionless hands and an unreadable expression, her body locked in a seemingly endless cycle of pregnancy. Not a single woman shifted position or allowed her expression to falter. In the years following my departure, I have wondered every single day if they were experiencing the exact same internal struggle, sitting through those declarations and forcing themselves to remain perfectly still simply because maintaining that absolute stillness was the only path available.